Welcome, everyone, to this explainer. I'm Dr. Lin, a language assessment expert, and today we're dedicating our time to a rigorous, but hopefully really practical, breakdown of Chapter 5 from I.O. Faculty's Language Testing and Assessment. We're focusing entirely on how we test and assess reading. Joining me to help unpack these concepts are Maya, a postgraduate TESOL student deeply immersed in assessment theory, and Tom, an early career language teacher who's here to ground our discussion in real-world classroom realities.
Hi, everyone. I am really excited to dig into the cognitive and theoretical side of reading today.
Hey there, and I'm here because I honestly desperately need some help. I'm looking forward to translating all this high-level theory into some actual practical advice for my syllabus.
Let's get right into it then.
Well, Dr. Lin, it's just incredibly frustrating. I have students who participate beautifully in class discussions. They seem to deeply understand the material when we talk about it, but when I give them a formal reading comprehension test, a huge chunk of the class just fails. And I'm starting to ask myself a really fundamental question. Are my students actually bad at reading, or am I just accidentally testing their test-taking skills? I'm seriously starting to suspect the design of my tests is the real culprit here.
That is such a common and, frankly, profound realization for early career educators. To fix it, we really need to completely deconstruct what it actually means to read and how we effectively measure that specific construct.
So, to help Tom audit his tests, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to systematically cover the nature of reading, look at some cognitive models, examine hidden performance factors, dive into task design, and wrap up with overarching principles and digital challenges.
So, starting with part 1, Maya, let's establish the foundational theoretical construct here. What actually is reading? Right, so we often think of reading as simply decoding words on a page, like a machine. But scholars like Urquhart, Weir, and Grob explicitly argue that reading is a highly complex, dynamic cognitive task. It's a totally interactive process between the reader and the text. And crucially, a reader doesn't just possess a single reading ability. Successful reading is an integration of multiple, different components all working together simultaneously. Exactly. Can you elaborate a bit on what those components are? Absolutely. True reading performance reflects the interaction of vocabulary knowledge, grammatical knowledge, and discourse knowledge, which is understanding how sentences actually connect to each other. On top of that, readers deploy inferencing skills, strategic reading, and critical reading to evaluate the text. It is a really dense web of cognitive operations.
And because of that massive complexity, the specific purpose of the reading fundamentally dictates the type of reading a student does. Vakiti outlines 5 key purposes: reading to search for information, reading for general comprehension, learning to read, reading to learn, and reading to integrate information. Those purposes map directly onto different reading styles. For example, if your purpose is general comprehension, you engage in extensive reading. If you need to search for specific facts or integrate complex information, you engage in intensive academic reading. Oh, wow, okay, hold on. I'm realizing a major mistake I've been making. I teach my students using functional texts meant for extensive reading, just trying to grasp the general vibe of the article. But my tests are intensely detailed, essentially demanding intensive academic reading, where they have to act like human encyclopedias. My assessments don't deliberately match the specific reading types we practice in class at all. Spot on, Tom. If your teaching purpose and your testing purpose are misaligned, your students will inevitably stumble.
Which brings us perfectly to our second section on socio-cognitive models of reading. To really understand where a student's reading breaks down during a test, we need a framework that illustrates how social contexts, like a highly stressful test environment, interact with their internal cognitive processes. Vakiti highlights this interaction beautifully by detailing 2 simultaneous processing systems happening in the brain. First, we have bottom-up processing. Think of this as the neurological lower-level mechanism. It's visually recognizing the letters, decoding the grammar, parsing the syntax, and retrieving definitions. Parallel to that is top-down processing. This is where the reader brings their own schemata, their existing background knowledge to the text to make inferences and predict what comes next based on context.
And we really have to remember that fluent readers dynamically bounce back and forth between both of these processes. If your test relies too heavily on incredibly difficult, obscure vocabulary, you force your students to over-rely on bottom-up processing. That entirely drains their cognitive resources, leaving them with practically no mental energy left for that top-down comprehension.
Let's trace the exact cognitive journey a student takes when sitting for one of your tests, using Vakiti's socio-cognitive model. Step 1 is reception, The visual input of the text on the page triggers that lower-level, bottom-up processing we just discussed. Step 2 is comprehension. This involves those higher-level processes and skills. This is where they actually apply techniques like skimming for main ideas, scanning for details, making inferences, interpreting the author's true intention, or evaluating arguments. Finally, step 3 is the response. They have to transition from understanding the text in their head to figuring out how to actually output an answer for your specific task format.
That three-step breakdown is absolutely critical because, Tom, a breakdown at any single one of those steps will result in a poor test score, even if the student is generally a fantastic reader.
So just to make sure I'm getting this, the crucial point here is that a student might be perfectly capable of evaluating the author's argument, which is step 2, comprehension, but if they fail at step 1 just because they don't know a specific vocabulary word I decided to throw into the prompt, they fail the whole question?
Yes, exactly. That's a localized failure of lexical access, which is just the precise process of matching a visual word on the page to the mental dictionary stored in your brain.
This is honestly a revelation. I've been looking at bad test scores for months and mistaking a minor localized vocabulary deficit for a total lack of reading comprehension.
That is a perfect transition to our third topic. Let's dig into the specific variables outside of pure reading ability that might be causing your students to fail. Because, Tom, as you're about to see, it's definitely not just vocabulary that acts as a roadblock.
FACTI categorizes these performance variables into reader factors and textual factors. Reader factors are internal, like the student's affect, their test anxiety, or just their personal motivation on that given day. But Tom, let's talk about textual factors, which directly relate to the vital practice of selecting your reading texts. When building an assessment, you have to carefully control text length, difficulty level, and authenticity, because they drastically alter the test's difficulty and fairness.
Absolutely. Textual factors even extend to topic familiarity and, believe it or not, typographical features.
Wait, typographical features? You're telling me that if I use a dense, tiny font size, or if I pick a culturally unfamiliar topic, say an article about an obscure American sport for my international students, I can unfairly tank their scores?
Precisely. Because in that scenario, you are no longer just assessing their reading ability, you are actively assessing their cultural background knowledge and, quite literally, their eyesight.
Okay, I am thoroughly convinced. My texts and my tasks need a complete audit from top to bottom. But how do I actually fix them? How do I design better tasks?
Well, let's move to section 4 and translate all this theory into practical task design. The absolute key here is alignment. We must evaluate how specific reading constructs, the exact mental skills you want to isolate and test, align with appropriate task formats.
Fakiti maps this out by aligning specific constructs with their optimal formats. It's about using the right tool for the job. For instance, if your construct is to see if a student can identify main topics, a matching headings task is excellent. The reason it works so well is that it avoids heavy writing demands, fully isolating their ability to synthesize the paragraph's core idea. If you want to test extracting facts or making inferences, multiple choice questions are highly targeted. And if you want to assess how well they synthesize information across a whole text, you move towards summary writing tasks.
So I shouldn't just rely on a massive multiple choice test for every single exam?
Definitely not. While multiple choice is highly reliable for testing factual recall, it lacks authenticity. I mean, in the real world, we rarely read a text and then mentally select A, B, C, or D. Mixing your task formats gives you a much more robust and valid picture of their true capability.
What about gap fill tasks? I see those used in language departments all the time.
They are super popular, mostly because they are highly practical for the teacher to grade. The two main types are the closed technique, where you delete every 6th or 7th word, and the C test, where you delete the second half of every second word. Both are designed to test how well a student uses surrounding context to restore missing information. Are they actually effective, though? They can be, but a major warning regarding C tests specifically is that they rely heavily on a student's spelling proficiency, which brings up the crucial challenge of scoring reading assessments. When a student clearly knows the correct missing word but spells it slightly wrong in a C test, strict objective scoring would mark it entirely incorrect. To capture their actual reading comprehension despite the spelling error, educators often have to implement partial credit scoring. This ensures the grade reflects their understanding, not just their orthography.
And that idea really underscores a critical rule of task design, which is perfectly captured in a quote from Chapter 5 regarding information transfer tasks. An information transfer task is when you ask a student to read a text and translate that data into a chart or a table. Fakiti notes, the focus of the test should remain on AL reading skills rather than mathematical abilities. So Tom, if you give a student a text about global demographics and ask them to complete a table, you must ensure they don't have to do mental math to find the answer. Otherwise, they might fail because they are poor at math, not because they are poor at reading. Let's pull all of these moving parts together in our final section. We are going to apply some overarching quality standards to address the most pressing modern challenges in reading assessment. If there is a single pivotal concept I want our postgraduate audience to internalize today, it is this definition: construct irrelevant variance. This occurs when a test inadvertently measures skills or knowledge entirely outside the target reading construct, unfairly inflating or deflating the student's score.
Wait, so when my students failed because of my tiny font sizes, or because they lacked the cultural background knowledge for the passage, or because my multiple choice questions had tricky trap vocabulary, that was all construct irrelevant variance?
Exactly. You thought you were measuring their reading ability, but you were actually measuring a dozen other completely irrelevant factors. And Dr. Lynn Fakidi emphasizes that controlling this variance is becoming profoundly more difficult with technology and digital assessment. Transitioning to computer-based reading environments actually changes the fundamental construct of reading itself.
How so?
Well, think about authenticity. In the real world, digital reading involves navigating hyperlinks, multimodal texts, and quick access to online dictionaries. However, online assessment platforms often lock all those tools down to maintain security, which creates a totally artificial environment. But on the flip side, moving to digital spaces opens incredible opportunities for computer adaptive testing, where the software adjusts the difficulty of the reading texts in real time based on the student's ongoing performance. It's a massive shift in how we approach assessment today. Which is exactly why, whether you're testing on paper or a computer adaptive platform, we must rigorously apply the core standards of high-quality assessment. Think of these not as isolated buzzwords, but as competing weights on a scale. A test must be valid, measuring the exact reading construct it claims to. It must be reliable, producing consistent, trustworthy results every time. It should be authentic, mirroring real-world reading tasks. It must be fair, completely unbiased against cultural groups. And, of course, it must be practical for the institution to actually administer. Tom, when you increase authenticity by using a messy, real-world article, you often lower reliability because that text is much harder to grade objectively. Your job as an educator is to balance this checklist for every single exam.
This has been incredibly insightful. I realize now that my past assessments were practically designed to trip students up with cultural barriers and heavy vocabulary, rather than genuinely allowing them to demonstrate their comprehension skills. I have a lot of auditing to do when I get back to my desk.
And that brings us to the conclusion of our explainer today. I want to leave all of our viewers, especially the postgraduate students and educators designing tomorrow's syllabi, with a final provocative thought. Before you print or deploy your next exam, ask yourself, is your reading assessment testing true comprehension, or is it just measuring vocabulary, test-taking savvy, and background knowledge? I strongly encourage you to leverage Fakidi's theoretical frameworks to rigorously audit your own work. Thank you to Maya and Tom for bringing such great perspectives today, and thank you all for joining us.